Hello, and welcome to our lecture today on the rituals of Muharram, which is a Muslim festival in South India. Even though Muharram is performed all over the world, we're going to be particularly looking at one instance of Muharram that's practiced in South India. So our context is we are back in Andhra Pradesh, which is where David Knight did his research on the Vedic Brahmins. So we were back in the sort of south and to the east of India. By this point, you should be pretty familiar with the map of India because we've looked at it in almost every class. So there are more Muslims, in fact, in South and Southeast Asia than are found in the Arabic world. Now, Hindu-Muslim relations are so essential to framing Hindu identity these days. It's important to look at the ways where we see sort of conflicts and also complicated interactions between Muslims and Hindus. Today, we're going to look at a situation where Hindus and Muslims share traditions and communities overall. Our next module will look at one instance of kind of an extreme conflict between Muslims and Hindus. While this is ostensibly a Muslim festival, a wide range of South Indian Bhakti terminology and practices are included. So in this Muslim ritual, we can actually see that it's taken up a lot of South Indian Bhakti tendencies. So we are in South India, we are in Andhra Pradesh, and the town we're looking at is called Guggudu. Now, the Muharram festival there is performed by Muslims and Hindus, but Muslims and Hindus will perform the Muhurram all over Asia, but the biggest, the most inclusive, and the most well-known performance of this festival is in Guggudu. It's a really surprising phenomenon. Okay, so the festival of Muharram is practiced throughout the Muslim world, as I keep saying. This starts with sort of a narrative that commemorates the death of various martyrs in the town of Karbala which would be in modern-day Iraq. Now, these martyrs are people who were killed for their faith, for instance, were supposed to be the descendants of Muhammad the Prophet, peace be upon him. So in 680 CE, there was a really long battle in which the Imam Hussein, who was the Prophet's grandson, and all of his supporters were killed tragically. They were besieged and killed. These descendants of the Prophet were in a conflict with the Umayyad Caliph, who had demanded their loyalty, and they denied that. This sort of moment galvanizes the splits between Sunnis and Shias over the authority and succession in early Islam, leading to the biggest split in contemporary Islam. So I think I have a map here. So if you look here, you'll see the dark green areas are places that are occupied by Shia Muslims, and then the lighter colored places are with Sunni Muslims. So these are two varieties of Islam, and the majority of Muslims in the world are Sunnis, but the Shias have a large and complicated tradition, which would take a whole other class to talk about it. But I find Shia Islam in particular to be really, really interesting. All right, so yes. Now, so folks will celebrate this Muharram festival in order to sort of commemorate the martyrdom of these martyrs at Karbala. Now, these memorials have public processions on the 7th and the 10th days of the 10th-day festivals. Now, some of these processions become sort of like a recreation of that battle at Karbala. So it's as they walk, and they sort of envision themselves and their town as being Karbala and being around these folks who were to be martyred at the time. Wherever someone performs this ritual, they sort of reenact the martyrdom, but they also try to envision the world, that the very town that they're in, as being identical to Karbala. In this sense, Guggudu becomes Karbala. This ritual imagination in the ritual processions and practices sort of remakes the world over. It would sort of be like as if you were to imagine at every nativity scene in the United States, if that was to be envisioned as if you were in Bethlehem. See how that kind of works? Okay. In many contexts around the world, though not here in Guggudu, men in particular will practice self-flagellation. They actually get sort of these sort of sharp sticks or sharp sort of knives, and They'll have sort of like leather studded kind of whippy like things, and they'll self-flagellate. Now, this looks kind of gnarly, and when you hear about Muharram on like the news and they report it, they'll generally show men who have whipped themselves and are bleeding all over the place. The one thing you got to note is that men want to self-flagellate and bleed to show how like brave and proud they are, but these are largely superficial wounds, so they're not actually hurt all that badly. And the style of beating themselves is to cause a lot of blood, but very, very little damage, even though it seems shocking to us. So the Muhurram in Guggudu is distinct from the more famous commemorations in large Muslim cities like Hyderabad. So Hyderabad is a large city about 250 kilometers from Guggudu, and there they have huge Muharram festivals. Now, in fact, Muharram is celebrated in lots of little villages, and in every village where they do Muharram, they do it with certain distinct localizations of the ritual. Local village, in fact, villagers will say that in Guggudu, they'll say that the reason why Guggudu is so famous for its Muharram is because Muslims and Hindus interact in it equally together. Hindus even use a hybrid name called Imam Jayanti for this Muharram festival. And that would mean, because Imam means like the great leader or whatnot in Persian, and Jayanti is Sanskrit, meaning like sort of glorious, sort of like the glorious day of commemorating the Imam. So they have a lot of these sort of hybrid Persian and Sanskrit type words. Now, Muslims and Hindus are not typically shown overlapping. You don't read about this a lot, but there's a growing body of literature that shows that there is more overlap in practice than people realize. This is especially found at the village level, and arguably the Muslims and Hindus are more distinct and oppositional than they've been at any time in the history of South Asia. But there are some overlaps between Hindus and Muslims that you'll see all over the place. You have sort of sadhus and fakirs and bauls. Now, what do I mean by these terms? So sadhu just means sort of like a good man or a renunciate Hindu. Then a fakir is kind of like a quasi-renunciate or ascetic Muslim. But in some conditions, like say with the Nath Siddhas, were the guys that invented Hatha Yoga, you may remember, they will often have a Sanskrit name when talking to Hindus, but they'll give a Persianate name when they're talking to Muslims. When it comes to these dudes that are wandering around and are renunciate ascetics, they have a lot in common. They have wandering lifestyles, they depend on alms and whatnot, and sometimes they go to the same religious sites, though they'll worship slightly differently. Like I just said with the Nath Siddhas, here's one over here on the left. You can tell by his earrings. Then you also have the Bauls. The Bauls are neither Muslims nor Hindus, and I've given you an optional reading about them today. Out of Dalrymple, there's an essay called "The Song of the Blind Minstrel," which is about Bauls. Bauls are kind of interesting because they're religious mystics and musicians who claim to be neither Hindus nor Muslims, but they draw heavily from both Sufi and from Tantra. Then you have Pirs and Virs. So a Pir is a local Muslim deity, but can also be a Hindu deity. Hindus will also revere figures called Birs and also Virs to make everything more confusing. They're usually worshipped in small stone monuments. Okay. You will have sometimes you'll have deities. What am I saying? Local deities who are, yes. Sometimes you'll have Hindu gods that are purely local and will also be revered by a Muslim. Sometimes you'll have Hindus that go to Muslim places and worship. There is a place called Malarkutla, which is a really interesting location in which there is this pier named Haidar Sheikh. And there at the inside of the temple, you have all sorts of people that will come and worship in a Muslim way. But outside the temple, they'll worship him in a more Hindu way. And in fact, you'll see Sikhs and Hindus They will undergo benevolent possession experiences and then work as sort of like oracles for Haider Sheikh. And Mallar Kutla is really interesting because in many sequences of communal violence that raged all around the town of Mallar Kutla, there has never been a large amount of religious violence in Mallar Kutla. So why is that? The locals actually say it is because of Haider Sheikh, because the Hindu and Muslim communities tend to worship together at a similar place, who is a Muslim but is still worshipped by Hindus. That has created sort of a communal identity and a lack of violence in the town of Mallar Kutla in the Punjab. Then you also have festivals like Holi, or here Muhurram and Guggudu. These are places where there's overlap, and Muslims and Hindus might do the same things. So we haven't really done too much with Islam, so let's just do sort of some general ideas. You have the 5 pillars of Islam, the so-called 5 pillars. So these are sort of the duties of someone to perform who is a good Muslim. So you declare your faith. So you convert, you become a Muslim, you declare that you are a Muslim. You do obligatory prayer or your namaz every day. Compulsory giving, so charitable giving to others and to the poor. And fasting in the month of Ramadan. So that's where they get up very early and eat, and then they don't take water or food all day until nighttime. They do that for a month every year. And once a year, and once in your lifetime, taking a pilgrimage to Mecca. So what are some other things that we see about Islam that are important here? Well, Muslims revere the family of Muhammad, the family of the prophets. Now, this Pier, this local sort of holy figure that's found in Guggudu, is thought to be identified with Muslim's grandson, Hussein. All right, so when we're talking about Shiism and Sunniism, or Shia, so Shia and Sunni Islam, we have one big difference. The Shias, and this is kind of important, the Shias tend to revere folks who are holy and live in the world. There's an idea that there is an imam or a great teacher who is hidden from sight, but you can know him through interacting with other holy people. Sunnis don't argue this. This is another reason why Shias will revere the tombs of saints, and Sunnis are very much against the reverence for tombs of saints. What is Muharram? So this is the second most holy month other than Ramadan, and it's characterized by religious processions and a commemoration of the martyrs at Karbala. In Guggudu, Muharram is called Pirla Pandaga, which means the festival of the Pirs in Telugu, a language I've always wanted to learn. While Muharram is practiced all over the place by Shias, this village of Guggudu maintains unique traditions. So it's not exactly the same as found everywhere. So, and then to make this clear once more, Muharram and the commemoration of the martyrs at Karbala is a Shia, not a Sunni Muslim holiday. And this is intriguing because while the town of Guggudu is only 10% Muslim, 0% of those Muslims are Shias. So there's Sunnis who are doing this Shia ritual. What is a Pier? Pirs are local religious figures in Islam. They are deceased saints. They have kind of an overlap with village and local deities. So you'll have a Pier who sort of oversees the neighborhood. They'll have a tomb that you can go to pray at. You see them all over the place in North India, but Pirs are generally Muslim holy figures who are deceased, but become saints and are able to function sort of like local deities at any given location. Most of their worship and the site of interaction with these Pirs is at their dargahs, and a dargah means a grave. Pirs are sort of like Muslim saints or spiritual leaders that function like casteless spiritual beings, sort of like gods. The argument that's made in Muhammad and Afsar Mohammad's text is that because they are Muslims, they do not operate in any sort of the caste system that is even found amongst the deities. So anyone can approach or interact with the Pirs. Now, I want to bring up 2 terms that Afsar Mohammad makes, oh, I spelled his name wrong there, to kind of understand sort of the dynamics of what happens at any Muslim site in India. To this, he gives 2 ideas to interpret Islam. I think actually looking at the second one is easier first. Local Islam. So local Islam is unique or non-sanctioned Islam of a specific place. It is Islam that has arisen in a location with that is thoroughly Muslim, but also has a whole bunch of, sort of like vernacular aspects to it. So instances of worshiping local figures, local customs, local processions, local practices. Local Islam is Islam as it is lived in a specific area. Now, your local Islam can have a varied level of connection to any other part of Islam, but generally the idea is they live their Islam, they understand that their Islam is kind of unique to their place, and they don't challenge that traditional Islam. This is the Islam of saints, dargahs, and a sort of bhakti style of worship towards some of these saints. Now, local Islam adapts and appropriates here South Indian devotional practices and uninstitutionalized Sufi or vernacular Islam. Now, so Sufi is considered to be the mystic branch of Islam. It is a higher level of piety and practice than other forms of Sunni Islam. Sufi comes out of Sunni, and it is the predominant mode of Islam that is found in South Asia. And in fact, India is probably more Sufi than it is any other type of Islam, because it was these Sufi saints who traveled around and established Islam in India. And Afsar Mohammad writes about uninstitutionalized Sufi, which means sort of the practices that Sufi saints sort of introduced and practices surrounding these saints that are not sort of sanctioned by any larger Islam, but are distinct to the religious location they're in. One of his informants refers to this Islam as being the Islam of our land, or Vatan, the Islam of their very place. As I'd said before, about 10% of Guggudu villagers are Muslims. None of them are Shia. Some people argue that the Pirs and local Islam, in fact, is a way for people to be Muslim and then can aspire to be more pious or more orthodoxly Muslim. Now, the conflict here between local Islam is with localized Islam. Now, localized Islam is a Muslim reform movement in which translocal Muslims, sort of the normative Islam, the Islam of the ulama, the community of the faithful, or the Islam of, think of it this way. When we're talking about localized Islam, people are trying to take like the Islam of the Arabic world and bring it to the villages and reform the villages to make them more appropriately like that translocal Islam. It's the Islam of a mosque as opposed to the Islam of the Pier house or the dargah. Localized Islam seeks to replace unique religious forms in favor of more normative and sort of accepted versions of Islam. Now, religious nationalism from both Hindus and Muslims over the year has led to many attempts on the part of folks who want to reform the Islam of Guggudu to reform Muhurram and to stop the veneration of the Pirs. However, the reforms are clearly not effective because there are more and more devotees coming to this festival every year. Okay, so we keep writing about, and I know I got confused when I first read this, because Afsar Mohammad always talks about these battle standards. What is a battle standard? Well, they're like metal flags, and they have a circle and then 3 points on them. You can kind of see them in both of these images here. They are decorated with all sorts of like garlands and jewelry and whatnot. And this is actually the only way to tell them apart. If they don't have all of the decorations upon them, they all look almost exactly identical. These represent the Pirs, and at various points they almost operate as the Pirs' bodies in these very festivals. These would be derived from, and the term battle standard comes from, these would have been derived from flags that would have been carried into battle to demonstrate who your kingdom is or what your army is. So your battle standard. What is a pier house? Now, a pier house, and here's a picture one on the right, and this is the pier house at Guggudu with, you see the piled up You can see when you look there, you see the Pier house. And then to the left of the house, you see there's a Hindu temple. And then in front of the Pier house is the big, crazy fire pit area, which is clearly, during the rest of the year, just a giant mound of ash and dirt that they dig out and then build fires there later in the festival. So this is not a mosque and it's not a temple. It's where the Pier, whose name in Guggudu is Kulayapa, he lives there along with other piers. The idea is that there's like 10 battle standards. There are like 10 other piers that hang out there, but Kulayapa is the big one. Folks come here year round to visit the pier, and they will come in and make little offerings and maybe even get like a little, like kind of a darshan of a framed picture that they keep in the house. In this pier house, they have a framed photograph of the battle standard, because for all but the 10 days of the festival, all of the battle standards are kept locked up and locked away, and nobody can see them or touch them in any way. People will go here just to kind of see the pier, commune with the pier, maybe fulfill a vow. They'll say, hey, if I can, get a new car, I'll come and see the pier. I'll come and see Kulayapa. Yes, there is a temple cleric there who kind of helps people perform the specific rituals of worship to the pier when they come to visit. Okay, so who is Kulayapa? Well, Kulayapa was considered to be identical to the eldest grandson of Muhammad. Hussein is considered the Hussein was the murdered grandson of Muhammad, who was martyred at Karbala. But there's another story. Well, Kulayapa was thought to be a reborn figure from the Ramayana, namely the figure of Guha. Guha helps Rama to cross the Ganges, or the Ganga, when he is banished by his stepmother and father. So even now, the town Guggudu means the place of Guha. So Guha, Gugu, Guggudu, Guggudu, the place of Guha. And some villagers will say that actually the town of Guggudu is built upon the ashram of Guha. Notably, Guha was low caste or an outcast figure in the Ramayana. Now, what happens is there is a Sufi prophet named Fakhruddin, who was originally Persian, and he came and brought the Muhurram rituals to India, and also began to talk about the reverence of this figure of Kulayapa, which in the indigenous language means something like the holy man who wears a little hat. And when you'll see pictures, if you see pictures of him, he always has a hat on. Look, he has a hat on him. Both of these pictures here as well, which is a little odd. You don't usually see people in hats in these types of pictures, at least these types of hats. Kulayapa is revered by both Hindus and Muslims. And even Hindus, do not deny the fact that he is a Muslim. And in fact, there are a number of figures, like Sai Baba of Shirdi is another one of them in South India, who are ostensibly Muslims, but are also worshipped by Hindus. So it's like, the funny thing is the Hindus claim these figures as being Hindu, but then they also don't deny that they are Muslim. So there's another instance of just this overlap. So let's go through and talk about the events that happen in Muharram, and I just want to go through and walk through these with you. Muharram happens for 13 days. It is considered to be some of the purest days of the year. There are the most auspicious and most pure days. It's a slightly less important holy month than Ramadan. For the people of Guggudu, it is huge because throngs and throngs of devotees come. In 2007, there were 300,000 pilgrims that came to this little town. It looks like other Muharram activities in other cities, but you'll see, and as we go through, that there are far more rituals that appear Hindu inspired or Hindu adjacent than you would find at another Muharram ritual. Guggudu is always a pilgrimage site year round for devotees of Kulayapa, but when Muharram comes, everything just gets jacked up to a whole other greater, bigger level. Guggudu is, like I said, it's always a festival site, or it's always a pilgrimage site, so people come all the time, but they really want to come during the time of Muharram. Key elements in Muharram include fire walking, site of the Piers symbols and the battle standards of the Piers, ritual feasting, ritual processions, and finally a sort of mock funeral at the end of it. So what happens on the first day? Well, on the first day, they've been doing some preparations for a little while, and it's called Pradakshina, which means the first sight. So everybody's been hauling in wood and getting everything ready for the giant fire pit that they're going to build. But the first day of Muharram is when the new moon crescent is first witnessed, depending on the time of day, or depending on the time of year, or the time of day or whatnot. You can have that crescent sliver of the moon will appear at one point. When that comes up, so greater than a new moon, suddenly you have it's on. So what happens is they've been preparing for a while and hauling in wood. And then on the first day starts when they see this crescent moon. The Pier House starts handing out a range of pamphlets that interprets the timing of all the rituals and explains what everything means. But the reality is that people don't really follow these pamphlets so much. They really just do their own family practices. So one thing to remember here when thinking about religion is tradition doesn't have to be ancient. It just has to be handed down once. So as long as I can say, I do it like my dad did it, that's it. That's all tradition takes, is to be handed down once. So you can start your own traditions. If you have kids, just make them up. Just say, oh, we've always done it this way. It's tradition. You know, it's just tradition only has to be handed down once. So on the first day, they pull out this chest where all of the battle standards have been living throughout the year. And they actually pull out an image, the biggest battle standard, which is the one of Kulayapa. And they kind of wave it around outside very quickly and then lock it away again. People are really excited because this is the first sight of Kulayapa that will become the focal point of this whole festival. They also bring forth a chariot, and that chariot will be used to transport the battle standards through the rest of the ritual. Day 2 begins the fire rituals. Now, there are fire rituals throughout the festival, but this is kind of an interesting one. So all the villagers join hands and they dig out the fire pit. And then begin to fill it with woods. They all do it together. Now, at this time, Hindus actually circumambulate the fire pit, and so do Muslims, in fact. But Muslims will not sort of sing a bhakti song or whatnot, but they will chant the Fatiha, which is the first verse of the Quran. So this is the Fatiha text, which when you were reading, you'd read over and over again, and then they chant the Fatiha. So they chant this all the time. In the name of Allah, the most, I will not be chanting it in Arabic. I don't know Arabic. In the name of Allah, the most beneficent, the most merciful, all the praise and thanks be to Allah, the Lord of Alamin, mankind, jinns, and all that exists. The Lord of all, in fact, the most beneficent, the most merciful, the only owner and the only ruling judge of the day of recompense, the day of resurrection. You alone we worship, and you alone we ask for help for each and everything. Guide us to the straight way, the way of these on whom you bestowed your grace, not the way of those who earned your anger, nor of those who went astray. So they're chanting this all the time, to the point that the meaning of it isn't actually as important. It's just important that they're doing the chanting. So when Hindus go to a temple or a holy place, after they take darshan, they'll usually do what's called Pradakshina. And Pradakshina means you travel, you walk around the inner sanctum, which is called the Garbhagriha, the womb house of the temple, and you travel, you walk around at least 3 times with your right hand to the deity. So you walk in a circle clockwise. So when they're doing these, when they're building the pit and looking at the pit, the fire pit, Hindus will circumambulate, and that's called Pradakshina. And Muslims will do the same, which you don't usually see this circumambulation in Islam in this way, especially at a holy site. So the best guess is it's based on the Hindu practice. So they do that, and the Muslims chant the Fatiha the whole time. Now, generally, people will argue, and Afsar Mohammad found this often, people would say that the cult of the Pier, the cult of worshiping Kulayapa, transcends Hinduism and any Hindu distinction, but it also transcends exoteric Shiism. So it transcends the Shia context that it comes from. The local worship of Kulayapa is thought to be bigger than Islam itself. Now, there'll be a number of firewalking sort of instances, and the locals argue that the reason they don't do the self-flagellation that I talked about elsewhere in the Shia world is because they do the firewalking. And in the firewalking, there's an opportunity for men to show their strength and also demonstrate and test their devotion. There's always a level of competition in there a bit. On day 3, things get exciting. They are going to install the piers. Here, a group of people who are considered clean and pure, who have done a whole bunch of preparations and have maintained, sort of ritual purity and whatnot, they will actually get out all of these battle standards and they chant the Fatiha and they scrub these battle standards with water and then dress them up and adorn them in these cloth costumes that makes them distinguishable. Otherwise, you couldn't tell them apart. You can always tell which one is supposed to be Kulayapa because that is the one at the very center of all of these different deities. Now, days 4, 6, 8, 11, and 12 are what they call resting days. These are days that nothing really happens. People will go to the Kulayapa Pier house, they'll hang out, and there's circumambulate the fire pit and whatnot. But on these days, the piers are thought to be resting. They're all supposed to be present and alive in the village, but they are just resting on those specific days. On these 4, 6, 8, 11, and day 12, folks do a lot of Nitya Fatiha, which means Nitya means eternal in Sanskrit, and Fatiha is that, again, the first verses of the Quran. So they'll do Nitya Fatiha, which is like the daily practices that they always do, but they just do more of them, in which they chant the Fatiha and think about Kulayapa and meditate upon him. They often burn incense while chanting this Fatiha. Day 4 has kind of an odd practice in which women will imagine a fire pit in their area and they'll go off by themselves and they sing and dance there, dedicating their songs to Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, peace be upon him. On day 5, we have the cordoning off of the city, or Sarigetu. That's a hard one for you. Sarigetu. And in this, they have like very small processions where folks wander the village edge and sort of small processions. And on day 5, we actually see commemorated the first 2 martyrs at Karbala, the first 2 sons of Zainab. On day 7, we have a big day. Day 7 is a big day. This commemorates the martyrdom of Qasim, the 13-year-old recently married son of Imam Hussein, so the great grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. This was the day that water was said to be cut off from Hussein and his followers. So folks do different rituals that feed one another and give each other water. It's a really busy day. They also have the Chinna Sarigetu, which means Chinna means little, which means the little procession. That means Chinna means like little or cute or minuscule. So it's very similar to what we would say. This is the first time that the pier on the little procession, the piers will actually wander the city. So they take out the battle standards and they do a small kind of wander around the city with the battle standards. And anywhere that people see the battle standards, or they feel that they've seen and interacted with the pier, if the battle standards go by their house, it's thought to be that the pier has come in and hung out at their house. And Afsar Mohammad writes about how lots of things that people will do at this time is like whitewash their house, clean their house, paint new adornments on their house and whatnot, because they want to have their house be sort of like pure and clean and festive as possible, to sort of invite the piers to come in and hang out. Also, the interesting thing is when people see the battle standards, they'll see things like, oh, the pier was so happy, or oh, the pier was so sad today, or oh, the pier cast his eyes away from me. And you think, wait a minute, that's just a big metal pole and an umbrella and some scarves. How can it have anthropomorphic figures? Well, remember, like when we were talking about Tamil Nadu, how you can't grieve, you can't feel the feelings of an emotion. of your informants. Our emotions are dictated by our culture. So when people consistently describe, like feeling these emotional like connections to these battle standards, the anthropologist goes, well, I don't feel that. I don't understand how they can feel that. You got to remember that you're not going to feel the things they feel because you are not from that culture. Okay, so we're on day 7. The China Saragetu is the first time that the Pirs wander the city, and it's thought that they come and visit and hang out in all the houses they pass. It is now that the Pirs are really active and in the world of the festival, and people can start having like interactions with them and describe emotional experiences. And the China Saragetu is 3 hours long. We'll see a later commemoration on day 10 where the procession is very long. In fact, goes all night. Women begin a 3-day fast from day 7 to day 10, and men become fakiri, or temporary ascetics. Here they buy a very special thread that's blessed by the cleric, the temple attendant at the Pier house, and then they tie that to their arms, and then they will suspend all sexual and material concerns, and they're like temporary ascetics, temporary renunciates for just 3 days. This procession only lasts 3 hours, which is short compared to the 10th day that goes on all night. And the Pirs do a brief fire walk at the end of procession, which means that after they do the procession, after 3 hours, the folks holding the battle standards then go do a fire walking instance at the center of the town by the Pier house. Okay, the final rituals are on the 10th day. These will conclude with funeral rites on day 11. So on the 10th day, they're thought to have died. On the 11th day, they do funerals. Okay, the martyrdom happens on the 11th day, on that day. Okay, so yes. So after this day, after this big day, the Pirs will be put back into their house for the coming year. There's actually a really solemn attitude on this 11th day. Everybody has felt so connected to the Pirs for 10 days, and now they feel disconnected, as if there's been a death. So on the day, that 10th day, they do an all-night religious procession, and then they light and then on the 11th day they do, or blah blah blah. No, so on the 10th day, sorry, on the 10th day they build a really, really big fire pit, and the cleric reads the Fatiha and lights the pit at 5 p.m. Everybody does Fatiha while the flames rise. Now, there's also going to be a lot of folk performances, so people will come around and hang out and do kind of like folk sort of dancing and folk stories and performances from all around the area. Finally, you have this big procession, the big 10th day procession, and they have these large red royal umbrellas, so the giant umbrellas there. They have these large umbrellas that sort of shield the Pirs, and they wander through the streets. And this is the day that there's just tons and tons of people as far as the eye can see. One family in particular will carry the Pirs on that 10th day. They actually have to do all these special preparations. They have special bathing rituals that they do, and they put on these really complicated outfits that Afsar Mohammad says it took like an hour for them to put on. And these were people he knew pretty well, and he couldn't even recognize them in these kind of like really cool get-ups that they are in. Okay, so they have this giant procession, and one family carries the battle standards, and everybody is really excited because this is the last time they're going to see the Pirs. So folks clamor to get sort of their last vision of the Pirs and to get some blessed sugar or to touch the battle standards, and women will even like touch their babies to the standards for good luck throughout the year. The Pirs wander the towns, and then they return to the fire pit where there's extensive fire walking. So for the 10th day, everybody walks the fire. The clerics walk the fire, then all the Pirs, then Kulayapa, and then the Pirs are laid in the house, and they're covered in red cloth, and at that point, they're considered martyrs. They're thought to have died at that time. So on the 11th day, you have extensive sacrifice and fasting. So people bring lots of chickens, and they kill them, and Afsar describes his white sneakers being all bloody and getting blood all over himself because people are just killing chickens left and right and then cooking them up and eating them. So around 4 p.m. on the last day, on the 11th day, they do a final fire walk and take a darshan of the Pirs for the last time. And then the Pirs are hidden. They are hidden for the whole next year, and no one else gets to see them. When the women see the piers in general, they'll pour water on their feet. Other women douse themselves with water and roll around the fire. It's wild. You got to believe it to see it. You got to see it to believe it. So the final day is called Akri, or Jaladi. Jaladi means like dropping it in the water in Telugu. Telugu is the language that they speak in Andhra Pradesh. So on the last day, the piers are marched out to this dried up well, corresponding to the water source in Karbala that is cut off. Once there, they remove the piers' costumes and wash them vigorously, just like you would do to a dead body. A cleric gives out a special bread that is cooked for that day as prasad, or edible grace, and folks offer a small amount of their feasting food that they've prepared to the piers, and then they have their own ritual feast. The piers are removed to the pier house that you see on the right there, and they live upstairs for the rest of the year. Okay, so there are some everyday practices at Guggudu that don't happen, that aren't happening at Muhurram. So I'll tell you about this. This is Nitya Fatiha. Fatiha, remember, the text of the Fatiha, and Nitya means eternal. So one of the things that people do regularly is they will go and light incense and say the Fatiha. This is also sometimes called namaz, which is the Arabic word for prayer. But Hindus will also use the term namaz for all of the Kulayapa rituals that they attend to. So, excuse me. Villagers go to the pier house whenever they find the need arises, or they need to fulfill a vow or something. In fact, there is a procedure if you are doing a short pilgrimage, not on Muhurram. In fact, people come throughout the year. They'll come as a family. The first thing that happens is the father says the Fatiha and makes an offering of sugar in the pier house, and the mother waits outside, and the father comes out and gives the blessed sugar from the pier to the family members. Then they circumambulate the fire pit and put ash on their heads. This could not be more Hindu. Selecting ash and putting it on your head is just such a typically Hindu thing. Then after that, they go to a Hanuman temple, which is actually right next door to the pier house. That's a Hanuman temple. You can see it. See Hanuman there? Hanuman there on the top. The top two figures are Hanuman. So they go to the Hanuman temple and they offer coconuts, and then they receive offerings of kumkum, which is like a red sandal powder that is given to them by a Vaishnava priest. So part of going to see Kulayapa is to go and make a little worship to Hanuman and interact with a Vaishnava priest. So oddly, not strictly Muslim there either. Finally, people will return to the pier house and they offer a lamp to a village goddess who has a small temple that I don't have a picture of right by the pier house. So these are lots of very Hindu and non-Islamic practices. Then there's also Kanduri, which is food offerings. So to fulfill a vow, give thanks, or to revere the pier in general, folks will prepare feasts. They prepare this food in the open air, and they take a small amount of the food and they shape it like a horse, and then they give that as an offering at the pier house. Then they feast wherever they are. We think that this tradition goes back long into the villages of Andhra Pradesh, and it gets sort of like filtered into this sort of worship of Kulayapa. Women will take a special bath by the pier house, and men will do a goat sacrifice in a very Muslim way, regardless if they are Hindus. So even if you're a Hindu, you're going to do this goat sacrifice in a Muslim manner, and you'll kill the goat in the proper way for Islamic halal food offerings. Food is considered impure if it is not done in the Muslim manner, and usually they'll actually have a Muslim come and cut the throat of the goat. Thursdays and Fridays, there are often folk performances at the pier house and around the pier house. So what are some overarching themes here? Well, it's sort of hard to sort out the Hindu and Muslim practices because everybody's doing all the same stuff. This suggests that religious boundaries are limited in local practices. They may be distinct. Hold on, let me say that more clearly. Religious boundaries are more porous and are less distinct in the local practices. Now, when you're looking at religious authorities, scriptures, and whatnot, they'll say, no, there's no connection between Muslims and Hindus. But when you look at what's going on the ground, you can see that there's a lot of overlap. These Pier traditions are found throughout India, but this one is a very local iteration at Guggudu. The rituals and festivals that they do around these piers really makes the piers come to life. It allows people to have experiences of these piers, even if that experience is by interacting with these battle standards. The rituals show the power and authority of the pier in local life. Now they cry out, Din Govinda, which is a kind of cry of glory and victory, but there's a combination of the Arabic word din and the Sanskrit word Govinda, which Govinda just means Lord, or one who's, I'm not going to, has to do with cows. Anyway, so there's a fair amount of hybrid language like this throughout these rituals, such as even calling Muharram Imam Jayanti, so Imam Persian and Jayanti being Sanskrit. Then you have Ziratu Darshanam. So darshanam, darshan, the Hindu word for, the Sanskrit word for having a vision of God, and ziyaratu means something like portable or something like that in Persian. And then nitya fatiha, nitya, Sanskrit word again, for eternal or constant or ever present. Fatiha is the first verse of the Quran, which is chanted. There's a bhakti vibe kind of all over the place for South India. It's like the piers, and Kulayapa is the main pier. People interact with them in the same way that they kind of talk about the saints, the bhakti saints and the bhakti deities. So in a way, this is localized Islam into, or this is, in a way, this is local Islam that is fit to South India. What do I have? Non-institutionalized Sufi is expressed in the Pirs and Muhurram. So the type of Islam spread by Sufi saints that would not be considered normative Islam in any way. This is really acted out and really kind of comes to life amongst the Pirs and at Muharram. In another way, you can't see God, and you can't really see the Pirs, but you can see if a Pir has a dargah, you can see their tomb. But in this way, when the battle standards come out and they're around, people can interact with them. They're thought to be really there and alive. Folks can have emotional experiences. Folks can make offerings, and it's thought that they can really transact with Kulayapa and with the different piers during the festival. The piers are experienced as public piers of the house, but they are experienced as a specific piers of a neighborhood. So when you go to Kulayapa and you go to the pier house, you get this notion that, all right, that's him. He's right there. But when they're wandering around the neighborhood, there's a sense that there are just like piers all over the place that you're interacting with, that they're very localized into your neighborhood. This form of vision of Islam is distinct from the Arabic world. It's distinctly South Asian, and it's very different from anything that we think of when we think of sort of Wahhabi fundamentalist Islam. When you talk about Hindu or Muslim fundamentalists and their conflicts with other Muslims, it is these types of practices of Muharram, Pier worship at dargahs and whatnot, that specifically Muslim fundamentalists are against and want to strip out of Islam. So in the end, we actually see quite a bit of overlap in this instance of Hindus and Muslims interacting with one another and even doing the same rituals and having the same festivals. So keep that in your head. All right, I'll see you next time.